Well, I was looking for a good video to deal with while sitting around on Discord's debate servers. And, biblical slavery came up, and it's been a while since we touched on that subject. Sounds good, Angel. Hey, Demon, can you give her a hand, please?
Of course, sir.
Honestly, I hate this topic. I find slavery of all kinds detestable. But during the intro, Angel showed me the video she wants me to go over, and, well, okay, I can hit this. Okay, well, let's get straight to it and get it over with, but please keep it under a minute and a half if you guys can.
Of course.
Suppose an atheist or a skeptic comes up to you and says, hey, your Bible not only supports slavery, but it encourages slave masters to beat their slaves within 1 inch of their life. If a man beats his male or female slave with a club and the slave dies as a result, the owner must be punished. But if the slave recovers within a day or two, then the owner shall not be punished, since the slave is his property. This is one of the many passages in the Old Testament that many atheists and skeptics will point to try to discredit the Bible and try to discredit the God of the Bible. So in this video, we are going to try to figure out how to answer that question by first and foremost looking at, does the Bible condone slavery? And then the second thing we're going to look at is, was the slavery in the Old Testament the same as the slavery that we saw in terms of slave trade here in the United States and other parts of the world? And then finally, there's this other little wrench that people have thrown in there is, does Jesus indirectly encourage slavery and beating slaves in the New Testament Gospels in his parables? So we're going to look at that towards the end of this video.
You guys want me to get into a heap of trouble, don't you?
No.
Well, okay then, let's get into this with this guy. I'm looking forward to seeing what he has to say on this and seeing if he can convince me that his Bible says and suggests what he has implied with this. But to address the things he said in the opening. Yes, that is there in the Bible. God tells you how to treat your slaves, and yes, God does decree that you can beat your slaves as long as they recover after a few days. Exodus chapter 21 also has this to say in verses 2 through 6. If you buy a Hebrew servant, he is to serve you for 6 years, but in the 7th year he shall go free without paying anything. If he comes alone, he is to go free alone. But if he has a wife when he comes, she is to go with him. And his master gives him a wife, and she bears him sons or daughters. The woman and her children shall belong to her master, and only the man shall go free. But if the servant declares, I love my master and my wife and children, and do not want to go free, then his master must take him before the judges. He shall take him to the door or the doorpost and pierce his ear with an awl. Then he will be his servant for life. So God declares that a master can give a guy a wife, have children in those 6 years, and they belong to the master as property. The only way for that servant to keep his wife and kids is to be the master's servant for life. I'll pause there and let our guest go on with his 3 questions. We will let him give his explanation and go from there.
Okay, so question number 1, does the Bible condone slavery?
Sure does.
Now, first and foremost, we need to understand some things, that the Bible does not condone a lot of things, but when there are laws that are created in the Old Testament, it's primarily because the thing that the law is referring to is something that God does not want to happen. Think about it. You don't create laws to regulate things that God does want to happen. No, you create laws to regulate things that God does not want to happen. Let me give you an example. The Bible has all sorts of laws about what happens when a man murders another man or another woman. But does that mean that God condones murder just because there are laws in the Bible that talk about what you should do if murder happens?
That is a terrible analogy, and he is dead wrong. Where, yes, God does make laws for things you shouldn't do, the biblical God absolutely makes laws for things you should do. Keep holy the Sabbath, honor thy father and mother, just a couple of examples. When it comes to things you should not do, it states these are things you should not do, and there is a punishment for doing them. In his case, thou shalt not kill is one of the 10 commandments. And right there in the same chapter that we talked about beating your slaves, specifically verse 12 to 14, say you will be put to death unless it was an accident. Generally speaking, if there is a punishment for something, it means you shouldn't do it. That being said, nowhere in the Bible does it say you can't own slaves. In fact, it's quite the opposite, since God literally says in the book of Leviticus 25, verses 44 to 46, your male and female slaves are to come from the nations around you. From them you may buy slaves. You may also buy some of the temporary residents living among you and members of their clans born in your country, and they will become your property. You may bequeath them to your children as inherited property and can make them slaves for life. But you must not rule over your fellow Israelites ruthlessly. You see how the Bible makes a distinction between life slaves and fellow Israelites? Because they are different and treated differently. Meanwhile, this specifically states you may buy slaves.
Another example is the Bible has laws about what should happen if somebody has sex with an animal, right? Does it mean that God is condoning bestiality? No. He's setting up laws to make sure that the community knows how to handle situations when people get out of line. And that is exactly what's happening here with the concept of slavery.
We pointed out this topic last week. The punishment is death. So, of course, he isn't condoning bestiality. This is another false equivalence even in his own video, because Exodus 21 says there is only a punishment if the slave dies after they are beaten. This is not a punishment for owning a slave. Owning one is fine from the context of the Exodus verse, but the Bible is absolutely clear bestiality is forbidden. So no, that is not what is happening here when it comes to slavery. Our guest is just coping.
It was never God's intent for a person to be the property of another person.
Show me where in the Bible it says you can't own a slave at all. You can't, because that's not in the Bible anywhere. Else you would have just opened with that, and this would be a very, very short video.
So to be clear, the Bible does not condone or encourage the mistreatment of slaves. However, it does allow for slavery.
See what he said? It abolishes the mistreatment of slaves. Like, they have to survive the beating. Not that you can't beat them. That's fine. They just have to survive. On to his second question.
This is going to lead us into the second question. What exactly is slavery in the Bible? And so as we look at the concept of slavery, people became slaves in the Old Testament in a couple of different ways. So let's first deal with the case of a Hebrew enslaving or being enslaved by another Hebrew.
Honestly, we're not worried about this too much. This was more of an indentured servitude. A Hebrew goes broke, can't afford to live, he offers himself up as an indentured worker. It's pretty much working for somebody else for a living. There's a limit to it as well, 7 years. After 7, the Hebrew goes free and the master helps pay to get him out back on his feet. Now, there is something that he does that is dishonest, and we're going to show this guy's dishonesty. Angel, don't cut this part this time. Let him make his entire point. Yes, I am sure.
If he was single, when he became your slave, he shall leave single. But if he was married before he became a slave, then his wife must be freed with him. Now, already you're seeing some very huge differences between the slave trade that we saw here in the United States and slavery in the Old Testament. In the United States, people were separated from their families. Women were raped. They were taken and beaten and taken by slave owners, and people were separated from their families and things like that. No, In this culture, if you came in with a wife, you were to leave with that wife. Now let's keep reading. If his master gave him a wife while he was a slave and they had sons or daughters, then only the man will be free in the 7th year, but his wife and children will still belong to his master. Now, this is pretty obvious here, but the reason for this is because let's just say you're a woman and you have a lot of debt and you come in and let's say you've only been working for a couple of months for this particular owner, and you end up getting married off to a man who's already been there for 6 years and he's getting ready to leave. So now you get to go free with this man, and you've only served for your debt as a woman for a couple of months, but because this man is getting ready to be freed, you get to go along with him. So no, God set it up to where it's like, okay, no, if I give you a wife while you're my slave, then she belongs to me, and you can end up going free. All right, so let's keep going. But the slave may declare, I love my master, my wife, and my children. I don't want to go free. If he does this, his master must present him before God. Then his master must take him to the door or doorpost and publicly pierce his ear with an awl. After that, the slave will serve his master for life. So notice the time that you served as a slave, you could have a wife, you could have children, you could be given a wife, you had a home, you had provisions, and you could actually get paid a wage while you are serving as a slave.
First of all, like we said before, this isn't the slavery that you would think. To compare this to actual slavery is just bad faith. This is indentured servitude, so that's strike one. Strike two comes with his dishonesty about the single slave being given a wife. That wife can't be given at any time during his servitude. But the wife doesn't get set free because she hadn't served long enough. She is not set free except under specific circumstances, and this comes from the same book he is quoting, so there's no excuse. Exodus 21, verses 7 through 11. If a man sells his daughter as a servant, she is not to go free as male servants do. If she does not please the master who has selected her for himself, he must let her be redeemed. He has no right to sell her to foreigners because he has broken faith with her. If he selects her for his son, he must grant her the rights of a daughter. If he marries another woman, he must not deprive the first one of her food, clothing, and marital rights. If he does not provide her with these 3 things, she is to go free without any payment of money. So the reason you can't take the wife with you is because she's owned by that master. So yeah, a woman is a slave for life, and the 7 years is only for the men. Also, the last thing about getting paid a wage, yeah, that was the entire point of indentured servitude. But that is only for fellow Israelites.
Now let's look at another way that slaves were acquired, and that was when Hebrews would acquire slaves from Gentile nations. So typically what would happen is that whenever the Israelites would go into war and they would conquer these other nations, typically there would be one of 3 things that they would do. Either A, they would kill all the people who was there so that nobody would survive, or B, they would take some of the women to be their wives, which is actually an act of goodwill because these women, all the men were dead, and so how would they provide for themselves? How would they make it in society? So it was actually an act of will, a generous goodwill for the Hebrews to take these women and allow them to have provisions and to be able to have children and things of that nature. And then the third thing is that they would take these people to be slaves.
Wait, what?
Yeah, there's a bit wrong there. First, I'm happy to hear that he at least understands that the Israelites were killing everyone in a town occasionally. It's rare you find someone that gives a nod to that, but the second point, he isn't correct. When they would take the women and children, keep that in mind, they were taken as property, spoils of war. So even in option B, the people the Israelites took were slaves. Option C is when the town would willingly surrender. I don't think our guy here really understands what the Bible is actually telling you. But in this case, it's chattel slavery. These people can't just leave. Let's pick up right where he left off and see what happens.
Sparing their lives but allowing them to work in the Hebrew culture. So let's see what it says about this particular type of slavery. However, you may purchase male and female slaves from among the nations around you. You may also purchase the children of temporary residents who live among you, including those who have been born in your land. You may treat them as your property, passing them on to your children as a permanent inheritance. You may treat them as slaves, but you must never treat your fellow Israelites this way.
See what he did there? Another dishonesty. He talked about the spoils of war and then goes into purchased slaves. Those are different. Before he was talking about spoils of war, and now he's talking about a purchased slave. But then he destroys his entire point that this isn't like the slave trade when he reads from Leviticus, where it says the purchased slaves are treated as property and they can be passed on to your children. It then differentiates these kinds of slaves from the Israelites by saying you can't treat your fellow Israelites in the same way you treat these purchased slaves, and captured slaves would get similar, if not worse, treatment than purchased slaves.
So once again, yeah, it's pretty clear that the Bible does allow for slavery. However, the idea of mistreatment of slaves is significantly and highly condemned. And we're going to see here that there are several passages of scripture that talk about the proper treatment of slaves in this instance. Now let's read some.
But no, hold up.
What?
Condemning the mistreatment of slaves, and he is going to use the line about the Israelites to support that?
Yeah.
I think he completely missed the point of the verse there. But let's see what he is going to pull up to support the slaves aren't to be mistreated.
First and foremost, kidnapping was completely condemned and punishable in the Old Testament. Now that already is very different than the type of slavery that we saw in the United States, where Africans were kidnapped and taken away against their will. Here it says they can purchase or buy these slaves. So let's read about this. All right. It says here, whoever steals a man and sells him, and anyone found in possession of him shall be put to death. So anybody in the United States who was guilty of stealing Africans or kidnapping them and taking them over to the United States, according to this verse, should have been killed, all right?
This is straight up not talking about slavery itself at all. This is about stealing someone else's possessions, where in this case, yes, it is a slave. But the thing here is the women and children that are taken from conquered cities are a form of kidnapping. It's kidnapping with extra steps of killing anyone that you aren't kidnapping. Secondly, this verse, Exodus 21:16, has many different translations. In some translations, only the kidnapper is put to death, which makes sense. How would the buyer know the person was kidnapped until after the purchase? And what if the person kidnapped never told the purchaser they were kidnapped? They could have been treated horribly, like just beaten regularly with a cane or a rod or a club, only to survive and recover a few days later, just to be beaten again. It makes more sense for only the kidnapper to be put to death.
Let's just say a slave escapes from his master. Notice what it says here. If slaves should escape from their masters and take refuge with you, you must not hand them over to their masters. Let them live among you in any town they choose, and do not oppress them. So the idea is this: if a slave somehow escapes from their master, it more than likely implies that that master was mistreating or abusing that slave. And therefore, the wrong thing to do would be to send that slave back to a master who has already been abusing or mistreating them. The right thing to do would be to allow that slave to live in your vicinity or even in your own home.
Oh, no. No.
You're being misleading again. I know why you are too. Shame on you. This isn't talking about Israelite to Israelite. This is talking about an outsider slave coming to Israel to escape. Just like an Israelite slave escaping from Israel for being beaten almost to death into another country would be given refuge in the same way. Making this out as if Israel is in the right here isn't being honest in any way.
And then there's another law regarding injured slaves. Notice what it says here. If a man hits his male or female slave in the eye and the eye is blinded, he must let the slave go free to compensate for the eye. And if a man knocks out the tooth of his male or female slave, he must let the slave go free to compensate for the tooth. So you see here, you don't just as a slave or just get to beat somebody and to however you want to. You don't just get carte blanche to do that. No. If you beat somebody and they have a bad eye, you have to go free. If you knock out the tooth, they have to go free. So what is this teaching?
What it's teaching is you can beat your slaves nearly to death as long as they can recover fully. The thing he isn't understanding is you are allowed to beat your slaves black and blue and bruised and bloody, just not to remove body parts. This is disgusting. Like, seriously disgusting. And it's akin to the transatlantic slave trade. The only difference here is in the transatlantic slave trade, the slaves brought to the U.S. were at times beaten to death. Israel was just told not to take it quite that far. Almost, but not quite.
And then finally, the verse in question, which is the idea of corporal punishment. And this brings us back to the verse I read at the very beginning of this particular video. It says this: if a man beats his male or female slave with a club and the slave dies as a result, the owner must be punished. But if the slave recovers within a day or two, then the owner shall not be punished, since the slave is his property. So this does let us know that, yes, corporal punishment was part of the culture, was part of the society. It was part of how people were disciplined in the military. But if you have someone who is a slave and they get out of order, they mistreat you, they do something wrong, let's just say they try to sleep with your wife or something like that. Yeah, you have the right to discipline them strongly to make sure that they don't get out of line again. And this is what it's talking about.
Did he just indirectly admit that it was okay to beat your slaves in the Old Testament?
Yeah, bitch.
Well, fuck. But yeah, this isn't about corporal punishment for the master. Well, yes, in a way, but it's saying that you can't kill your slaves, which is part of the thou shalt not kill part of the 10 Commandments. You know, I'm not really sure how he's going to try to recover from this gaffe. He's basically just admitted completely to physical violence to chattel slaves. So, other than the killing of a slave, how is this different from the transatlantic slave trade? I'm not really seeing it, you know. The slave trade then was absolutely horrific, don't get me wrong. So terrible I'm uncomfortable talking about it and describing the shit that happened then. And this is just very similar in most ways.
Now, the third and final thing we'll look at is, does Jesus condone the beating of slaves in the New Testament in one of his parables? So when we come to Luke chapter 12, verses 47 and 48, it says this: and a servant who knows what the master wants, but isn't prepared and doesn't carry out those instructions will be severely punished. But someone who does not know and then does something wrong will be punished only lightly. When someone has been given much, much will be required in return. And when someone has been entrusted with much, even more will be required. So once again, guys, this is the reason why it is so important for you and I to have a strong hermeneutic, a strong method for how we study the Bible, because many atheists and skeptics will just take verses like this, cherry pick them, pull them directly out of their context and try to make the Bible say something that it doesn't say.
Oh boy, here we go, New Testament. Now, the irony here is he's taking this out of context while talking about an atheist like me taking things out of context. So let's bring this back in context and see what it says just before his quote to see why it's saying that. Luke chapter 12, verses 42 to 46. The Lord answered, "Who then is the faithful and wise manager who the master has put in charge of his servants to give them their food allowance at the proper time? It will be good for that servant whom the master finds doing so when he returns. Truly I tell you, he will put him in charge of all his possessions. But suppose the servant says to himself, 'My master is taking a long time in coming.' And then he begins to beat the other servants, both men and women, to eat and drink and get drunk. The master of that servant will come home on a day when he does not expect him, and at an hour which he is not aware of. He will cut him to pieces and assign him a place with the unbelievers. There is a punishment for the master's charge because he fucked up. That charge is still a slave for their master. And the Bible says if they're fucking up, to kill them. To cut them to pieces and bury them with the unbelievers. So the Bible doesn't just command the beating of slaves, but the killing of them in the New Testament, if the one put in charge of the others does not do as he instructed.
Jesus fucking Christ!
Yeah, and that's who's endorsing it. Jesus fucking Christ. The Messiah himself is telling you to kill. So much for the 10 Commandments, right?
Sorry if that's weird.
Now, before we leave, I want to give a shout out to a few of my regulars. Lauren Crest 2013, Capello M, John Byrne 8031, Claude Balls, and Big Bad Mama End, the Barely Bearable Atheist. Where Barely Bearable has recently found our little slice of YouTube, everyone else has been with us for a good amount of time and regularly engaging. Thank you and everyone else for your great support. I really appreciate it. You're all awesome. But for now, I am Corsi and this is the Fluffy Atheist. Pet those like and subscribe buttons, and remember, if you faith around, I will help you find out what your Bible really says.